Today, we will talk about Stellar and the Wyoming Stablecoin, which has had some developments over the last few months. However, there are still a lot of ties into Stellar and the PayPal Mafia. And the comment on Interstellar really makes a lot more sense now, and we will explain that here in a little bit. The most newsworthy thing about Wyoming recently has been they actually turned down a Bitcoin strategic reserve despite their senator being extremely pro-Bitcoin. I did a video a few months ago related to how Stellar was actually positioned extremely well here and how there was a lot of drama, and especially out of Charles Hoskinson, related to how Ripple and XRP were not in the finalists. And the primary update and announcement here is that LayerZero has been chosen as the token issuance partner for the Wyoming stablecoin. And I know a lot of people right now are asking, how does that have to do with Stellar? Well, I will explain, I promise.
At my left by Governor Mark Gordon, the governor of the state of Wyoming. He's been in that role since 2019, and before that served as state treasurer as well as a director at the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. Governor Gordon currently serves as the chairman of the Wyoming Stable Token Commission, which expects to launch the first fiat-backed and fully reserved stable token issued by a U.S. public entity in a few months. And to that extent, we have a bit of an exciting announcement to make here. As of today, the Stable Token Commission has formally engaged LayerZero as our token development and distribution partner. And we have stable tokens, Wyoming stable tokens, on several test networks already, 7 of our candidate blockchains. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but we're incredibly excited to have the support of the LayerZero team, and we're excited to have testing underway.
I was initially not too enthusiastic about that because it seemed as if Stellar was extremely well positioned to be the obvious home run choice. However, once I began to check into it more and once I begun to get a little bit more information on what LayerZero actually is, that announcement does not rule out Stellar. I will explain it here in a little bit, but LayerZero is extremely comparable to Axelar. So Stellar and Axelar have a ton of involvement, and it's more of an interoperability kind of a chain. So yes, it is technically an L1, but in the application here in the Wyoming stablecoin, it could really end up more as an L0 with the L1 kind of processes running on Stellar. One more big part of the Wyoming stablecoin is Paxos. They are also heavily involved in the stablecoin development work in the project, and they have been one of the huge announcements and the huge expansions with Stellar over the last 6 months or so now, which lines up extremely well with how Paxos and Stellar have been talking a lot about stablecoins and regulations. I commented on this recently, I think, but the FDIC has effectively said that financial institutions are now allowed to participate in quote-unquote crypto activities. In the 2024 Q4 presentation that Stellar had, they talked about Paxos and Wyoming specifically. And I personally don't think that they would really talk about Wyoming a whole lot if they knew that they weren't going to be heavily involved.
As one of the industry's most watched verticals, Stellar continues to be a leader in this category. In Q4, we got great news that Stellar was listed as one of only 5 qualifying chains for the first Wyoming stablecoin. This would be the first fiat-backed, fully reserved stable token issued by a public entity in the United States. And with the new administration and shifting sentiment, it really might not be the last. Either way, it's great to have Stellar central to the conversation. Additionally, 2 of the key objectives for the quarter were 1, to attract new assets to the network, and 2, improve the infrastructure for future adoption. At Meridian, we announced the Paxos integration with the Stellar network, bringing USDL to Stellar. This integration is well on its way, and I am looking forward to coming back here next quarter to talk about what else we have in the works.
So here is Paxos actually directly commenting on the FDIC new regulations and the guidelines. And I just find it really interesting that they're talking about the same kinds of things that Stellar is actually working towards that don't really have a lot of attention. In the comment, it says that it is a strong indication that the US is prepared to emerge as the hub for digital assets and financial innovation. He actually called it out as re-emerge, but I don't think that that word is accurate. On stablecoins overall, here we have a chart that shows the transaction value in between traditional payments, which are all fiat, and stablecoins. Now, I haven't talked about it directly yet, but Stellar and MasterCard are working together more and more. They are also directly and indirectly connected with Visa as well. The important point here is that the volume of stablecoins was way higher than I had ever expected. In 2024, it was almost 16 trillion, whereas in 2023, it was just under 8, which was fairly consistent all the way back to 2021, which picked up a lot as compared to 2020, which was probably about 1.6. So it hasn't surpassed the combined transaction volume. However, it is a higher volume as compared to the top payment processor out there. And that is important because Paxos and Stellar almost exclusively are concentrating on different kinds of applications that are really revolving around stablecoins at this point. Here is the CEO of Paxos presenting in front of Congress for one thing or another, but the important part is what he actually has to say.
Right now, all you need to have is a wallet on your smartphone in order to be able to hold a blockchain-based dollar or a stablecoin. And that means that people all over the world who don't have access to the traditional financial system, who don't have access to a bank account, which by the way is billions of people, can now have access to the US dollar. And they want the dollar because most of those people who are unbanked or underbanked are potentially in countries that have depreciating currencies, as Patrick was pointing out.
So in his explanation there, he's kind of directly addressing two, in my opinion, opposing ends of things. Yes, of course, he is harping on the humanitarian, let's provide access to the people on Earth who are unbanked. And that, in my opinion, has enabled crypto companies, and especially Stellar, with their involvement with the UN, in order to fly under the radar of a lot of critics because they're trying to do it for humanitarian things, right? The other, and in my opinion, more important point here is that the more people who can get access to a electronic form of the USD, the more it spreads into economies on Earth, and especially into economies that are not strong at the moment. And the more that these economies are able to expand upon the questionable reliability of the value of the USD, the more that the strength of the United States and the USD will remain. In other words, it kind of counteracts the BRICS and the crash of the dollar thing, which I was into. However, with all that I've seen, I have gone heavily into the more and the quicker that we can get US stablecoins out, the more that won't happen. Here is the report on stablecoins from the United States Treasury. It is from 2021. However, it does call out Stellar, along with people like Paxos, Stripe, which is another Stellar heavy, Visa, Circle, which is hugely involved with Stellar, and it even talks about Anchorage, which, despite a bunch of the XRP related hype, it still has its own involvement into Stellar as well. And there's not any other crypto related entities called out here aside from Stellar. That is probably where I should have made the whole spiel about the strength of the USD and stablecoins, but I got a little ahead of myself apparently. Here we get into another really interesting point, and one that does not really get picked up on. Stellar is in the top 3 in terms of tokenization by total value on chain. And that comes behind Ethereum and ZK Sync, which I think is some Ethereum L2 application thing. I'm not even sure, honestly, because I don't really think that Ethereum will be the tokenization king for that much longer. The important part, especially for where we are about to go, is Franklin Templeton is the highest RWA by value contributor into the tokenized value on Stellar, and they're really not stopping anytime soon. However, the point in the post was that if you included Ondo in there, then it would essentially 2x what is here, which would bring you into third still. However, it would still be 1 billion or so in confirmed tokenized assets. And as we speak about Ondo, there are a lot of Ondo connections into Stellar. So Ondo joined MasterCard's network that connects institutions with companies to improve cross-border payments. You've got a lot of involvement in between MasterCard and Stellar, as well as Ondo's yield-generating stable token on Stellar. And here's a post about it directly from them that calls out MoneyGram, Lobster, and Decaf, which are all extremely high potential applications on Stellar, and they already are extremely high value and are live on Stellar now. The thing that a lot of people miss about Ondo, which I actually comment on a lot, is that their VP of marketing actually came out of Stellar, so it makes a lot of sense. I have talked about the Meridian 2024 conference and the significance of that. There was tons of stuff out of there. You had Paxos, Stripe, and Paxos, along with the MasterCard integration of Stellar. As far as Paxos goes, it does have regulated stablecoins here right now. We kind of have to wait to see how everything shakes out with the stablecoin related bills in the government right now, but I don't think things like Paxos and Circle and Ondo will have a lot of trouble trying to come into compliance or just outright prove compliance. Then we've got Paxos and Visa, which not only goes back into that chart on payment processors and stablecoins, it also calls out Kraken FX, which if you look at the 2021 Treasury report, it calls them out here as well. Then you have Paxos, PayPal, and Venmo combining with PayPal's own stablecoin. Then you have Coinbase and PayPal combining on their stablecoin, which then goes back into Paxos, which then goes back into Stellar again. And it all just kind of comes back into this whole PayPal Mafia controlled financial infrastructure that I've really been concentrating on for pretty much since I started to make content on here. So here I want to get into LayerZero because that's really at the core of the Wyoming Stable Token news itself at the moment, but more importantly, how it ties into the PayPal Mafia and the likes of Stellar and Ripple. So they announced it as the token issuance partner, which people like Paxos and PayPal are a token issuance partner of Stellar. So it's not counting anyone out right now. It's just calling out one kind of specific application of the entire effort. I haven't ever really looked into them a whole lot because I just haven't had to. But as of mid-May, they were at 4 billion in terms of value on this new offshoot of Tether. And as of today, they had already added another billion in just under a month. They also have a lot of products and applications that revolve around interoperability at this point. I'll probably talk more about those specifically at a different time, but they have a bridge out there at the moment, and it's probably a little bit more significant to this conversation here. However, I still won't get into it a whole lot. They do have a multiple transaction protocol that only requires one signature. And I'm not an expert on the tech end of this stuff, but it's kind of combining the ease of single signature transactions with the functionality of multi-signature, multi-transaction kind of things. So here is where I got the LayerZero and XLR comparison from, which I'll probably honestly concentrate on all of this stuff on its own here soon. But LZero has ultralight nodes where you choose two parties and they independently sign off, and that can not be as ideal as other protocol approaches such as XLR. They communicate across chain with full state proofs and other technical stuff that essentially means, yes, LZero might be able to do basically the same things XLR can, but XLR is still able to pinpoint certain parts of the process more effectively at this point. However, this is kind of written from a marketing kind of approach, so I'll check into this more here in the future. Here is the LayerZero site, which I was a little confused by it at the start, but if you go to the catalyst, which is more about their ecosystem, I immediately checked out who their investors were, and you have A16Z and PayPal Ventures and Franklin Templeton, which are really interesting because all of those have a lot of history with the PayPal Mafia. However, if we're just talking about Stellar, obviously PayPal and FTI are huge. So that got me looking at the follow the money map that the XX account and utility theory have. And if you look at LZero in here, they are invested in by a number of people. So you've got Sequoia Capital, OKX, which has a lot of ties into Stellar that I haven't actually gotten into yet. You've got Circle Ventures and A16Z that stand out. Then you have different rounds of funding. You've got Andreessen Horowitz, PayPal Ventures, Coinbase Ventures. You've got Sequoia in there at each one. FTX Ventures. You have Binance, which also has a lot of Stellar and UN ties. So there is a lot here. And the thing that stood out to me the most, aside from the obvious ones like PayPal and A16Z, was the prevalence of Sequoia. And that name sounded really familiar, but they are heavily experienced in the fintech and technology spaces. They have invested in Apple, Oracle, Google, Cisco, and all kinds of other stuff, including OpenAI, which their CEO is on the advisors for Stellar. They're involved with Fireblocks, Stripe, SpaceX, and X. So a lot of the things that I am always talking about that all come back into Stellar, Ripple, Stronghold, and the people in the PayPal Mafia. For one reason or another, I thought that David Sachs had some experience with Sequoia Capital related to Stronghold. His company, Craft, received funding from Sequoia, but there's not really a lot of direct correlation aside from that. So I'm not really comfortable in attaching his name on this. However, when you look into what other significant PayPal Mafia people have been directly associated with Sequoia Capital over time, the main person it found was Roloff Botha, who I know that I didn't pronounce his name well, but he was the CFO at PayPal, and then he became a partner at Sequoia and has invested in YouTube, Instagram, Square, which has a lot of PayPal Mafia ties. 23andMe is also a really interesting one that has ties in to XRP and the PayPal Mafia too. But if you look at him on this map, he has some interesting connections of his own. It goes back into Stanford, where the designer of the Stellar consensus protocol actually came from. And then, of course, he was involved in investments in PayPal. And that was all I could find on the direct connections at the moment. However, With all of the advancements in the US regulatory environment and Stellar's involvement in the first US state stablecoin, I don't really think Stellar and LayerZero are anything to ignore.